And welcome to Sex 101. Sex 101 is created to empower our success and our relationship. Another week, another great episode. The Virgin and the Whore. Oh, wow. Why the church split the feminine soul in half?
Yes, this might be our most provocative episode yet. We're diving into something that shaped Western culture for nearly 2 millennia, how early Christianity created two competing images of the feminine soul. When we say the virgin and the whore, we're not being inflammatory, just for shock value.
Shock value indeed. So we're looking at the first to fifth century specifically. Why is the time frame so crucial, Mr. Mac?
That's is actually how many scholars describe what happened in early Christian thought. The church inadvertently created this psychological split where women were either pure, untouchable virgins like Mary or fallen, dangerous temptresses as they portrayed Mary Magdalene. What's fascinating is that this wasn't intentional, and it definitely wasn't what Jesus himself taught, but the consequences have been enormous. These 4 centuries were when Christianity went from a small Jewish sect from the dominant religion of the Roman Empire. The decisions made during this period about doctrine, about women, about sexuality, these weren't just theological debates happening in ivory towers. They were creating the psychological and cultural DNA that would shape Western civilization. In conclusion, when you really dig into what happened, you discover that authentic early Christian was actually far more liberating for women than what came later.
So we're looking at the first, or what was the world like for women when Christianity first emerged?
The Romans named the area Palestine under their occupation. If you're a woman, your value is essentially determined by your relationship to men and your sexual purity. Jewish law provided some protections that were actually progressive for the time. Women could own property, initiate divorce in certain circumstances, but Roman culture was simultaneously more permissive and more exploitative. Elite Roman women had freedoms unknown to their Jewish counterparts, but the empire also normalized the sexual exploitation of slaves and lower class women. Jesus violated every social convention of his time when it came to women. He talked to the Samaritan woman at the well, a double taboo because she was both foreign and sexually compromised. He defended the adulterous woman from stoning. He allowed Mary of Bethany to sit at his feet like a male disciple, which scandalized even his own followers. And crucially, women were the first witnesses to his resurrection. In conclusion, in a culture where women's testimony wasn't considered legally valid, Jesus made them the primary evangelists of the most important event in Christian history.
What was the world for women when Christianity first emerged, Mr. Mac?
And this is where we find out how this got a liberating message got twisted into something that seems to constrain women. And here's where it gets complex and honestly heartbreaking. As Christianity spread into the Greco Roman world, it encountered philosophical traditions that were deeply suspicious of the body, sexuality, and by extension, women. Greek Platonic thought saw the physical world as inferior to the spiritual realm. This wasn't Jewish thinking at all. Hebrew thought celebrated the body as God's good creation. But as educated Greeks and Romans converted to Christianity, they brought these dualistic ideas with them. The early church fathers, trying to articulate Christian sexual ethics in this Hellenistic context, began emphasizing virginity as the highest spiritual state. Now, there's nothing wrong with celibacy as a spiritual discipline. Jesus himself was celibate, and Paul recommended it for those who called to it. But what happened was that this got twisted into a hierarchy where virginity became more holy than marriage, celibacy more spiritual than sexuality within marriage. And Mary, the mother of Jesus, becomes the ultimate symbol of this virginal ideal. She becomes the impossible standard. Here's a woman who's both a virgin and a mother, something no other woman can achieve. The early church is developing Mariology, while beautiful in some ways and most ways, inadvertently created this unreachable archetype of feminine perfection. Mary becomes the woman who somehow transcends all the problems associated with female sexuality. She's pure, she's obedient, she's defined entirely by her relationship to God through her son. And on the flip side, we have Mary Magdalene representing the other extreme. This is where historical accuracy becomes really important. The real Mary Magdalene, according to the Gospels, was a devoted follower of Jesus who had 7 demons cast out of her. There's absolutely no biblical evidence she was a prostitute. That identification came later, probably in the 6th century, when Pope Gregory the Great conflated her with other women in the Gospels. But by this time, this false identification took hold. She had already become the archetype of the redeemed whore, the fallen woman who finds salvation through Jesus. So we have these two Marys representing these impossible extremes of femininity. And that's tragic because both representations, while containing elements of truth about God's love and redemption, became psychological prison cells for women. You're either the pure virgin who never experiences sexual desire, or you're the fallen woman who needs constant redemption for your sexuality. There's no middle ground for the ordinary woman who experiences sexual desire within marriage, who struggles with temptation, who is both spiritual and sexual. In conclusion, the historical background reveals that while Jesus' original teaching was remarkably liberating for women, the encounter between Christianity and Greco Roman philosophy began a process that would split the feminine soul into impossible competing archetypes.
Mr. Mink, but somehow these liberating message got twisted into something that seems to constrain women. How did that happen?
So the twisting here was because of the key figures in creating this theological framework around women and sexuality. The story really begins with Paul the Apostle, though I think he's often misunderstood. Paul's letters show a man who worked closely with women leaders, Priscilla, Phoebe, and Junia. His famous passage about wives submitting to husbands needs to be read in the context of radical mutuality for his time. But Paul was also trying to navigate how this new faith would interact with existing social structures, and some of his practical advice got elevated to eternal principles. Jerome, who lived from about 347 to 420, is crucial here. He's the scholar who translated the Bible into Latin, the Vulgate translation that dominated Western Christianity for over 1,000 years. Jerome was brilliant, but he was also deeply influenced by classical philosophy's suspicion of the body. He wrote extensively promoting virginity, arguing that marriage was only acceptable as a lesser good for those who couldn't maintain celibacy. Augustine is the most complex figure in this story. His early life included a long term relationship with a woman who bore his son, and his confessions reveal someone who's struggling deeply with sexual desire. After his conversion, he developed the theology that connected original sin specifically to sexual desire and the act of procreation. For Augustine, every human being is born carrying the guilt of Adam's sin, transmitted through the sexual act itself. Hebrew thought celebrated sexuality within marriage as a part of God's good creation. The Song of Songs is explicitly erotic poetry that made it into the biblical canon. But Augustine, influenced by his own struggles and Platonic philosophy, created a theology where sexual desire itself became suspect, even within marriage. He argued that if Adam hadn't fallen, humans would have reproduced through pure rational will, without passion or pleasure. Augustine's theology demanded that Mary be not just a virgin when Jesus was conceived, but a perpetual virgin, never experiencing sexual desire or sexual union, even within marriage to Joseph. This wasn't originally about honoring Mary, it was about protecting Jesus from the contamination that Augustine associated with sexual conception. Mary becomes the woman who somehow bypasses all the problems Augustine saw with female sexuality. John Chrysostom, the golden tongued preacher of the late 4th century, wrote beautiful homilies about women's capacity for spiritual greatness. But he also developed elaborate theories about why women were more susceptible to sin, drawing on the Genesis account of Eve's temptation. Women, in his theology, had greater emotional and spiritual volatility. They could achieve great heights of devotion, but they were also more prone to spiritual deception. Even before the later confusion about her being a prostitute, Mary Magdalene represented something that both attracted and terrified these early theologians: passionate emotional devotion to Christ. Her tears at the tomb, her desperate love for Jesus, this became the model for female spirituality. But it was always viewed as more volatile, more dangerous than the rational, controlled spirituality they associated with men. Some of the Cappadocian fathers, like Gregory of Nazianzus, maintained a more integrated view of human sexuality. And there were remarkable women like Macrina, Gregory of Nyssa's sister, who demonstrated forms of Christian spirituality that didn't fit neatly in either the virgin or whore categories. These voices were increasingly marginalized as the church's institutional structure solidified. When Constantine legalized Christianity in 313 and it inevitably became the empire's official religion, church leaders had to create systems that would govern millions of people across diverse cultures. The nuanced relational ethics of the early Christian communities gave way to clearer, more rigid categories. It was easier to say virginity is holier than marriage than to help each person discern their individual calling. In conclusion, the key figures of early Christianity, while often well intentioned and brilliant, were operating within philosophical or cultural constraints that led them to create increasingly rigid categories for understanding women's spirituality and sexuality.
Mr. Meek, who were the key figures in creating this theological framework around women and sexuality?
So these key figures looked at a Christian doctrine and began to systemize these ideas about women, sexuality, and spiritual purity. The development of what we might call theological anthropology, how Christianity understood human nature, is where these ideas really crystallized. Early theologians were trying to answer fundamental questions. What does it mean to be made in God's image? How did the fall affect human sexuality? What does redemption look like for the human body and human relationships? Their answers reflected the philosophical tensions of their time. Take the doctrine of original sin that Augustine developed. In trying to explain how sin is transmitted from generation to generation, Augustine connected it directly to sexual conception. This meant that sexuality, even in within marriage, became associated with spiritual contamination. The only way to avoid this contamination was either complete celibacy or, in Mary's case, miraculous conception. Marriage became a concession to human weakness rather than a reflection of God's design for human flourishing. Jerome famously wrote that marriage is good only because it produces virgins. Think about how devastating that is psychologically for married women. Your highest spiritual achievement is producing children who will hopefully choose the supposedly superior path of celibacy that you couldn't manage yourself. The church developed elaborate classifications. At the top were constructed consecrated virgins, women who took vows of celibacy and were considered brides of Christ. Below them were widows who chose not to remarry, then married women who remained faithful to one husband, and at the bottom, women who had experienced divorce, adultery, or any form of sexual irregularity. This is where the Marian doctrines began to develop, and they're fascinating from a psychological perspective. Mary becomes the new Eve, the woman who undoes what the first Eve supposedly did through disobedience. But here's the crucial point: Mary's obedience is specifically connected to her sexual purity. She becomes the woman who saves humanity precisely because she transcends normal female sexuality. Think about it psychologically. Every other woman is being compared to someone who experienced supernatural conception while remaining sexually pure, who never struggled with sexual desire, who achieved perfect obedience through perfect purity. How can you compete with that? You can't. So women are left with two options: attempt the impossible perfection of Mary, or accept the role of the reformed Magdalene, who requires constant forgiveness for her sexual nature. Mary Magdalene becomes the prototype for something theologians call a penitent whore, even though, again, there's no biblical evidence she was actually a prostitute. But theologically, she represents the possibility of redemption for sexually fallen women. Her passionate love for Jesus becomes the model for how fallen women should relate to Christ through emotional intensity, tears, and dramatic gestures of devotion. Male spirituality became associated with reason, theological study, church leadership, and controlled devotion. Female spirituality became associated with emotion, mystical experience, physical mortification, and dramatic conversion from sexual sin. Even when women demonstrated intellectual gifts or leadership abilities, these were often interpreted as exceptions that proved the rule. Early Christian church fathers increasingly viewed the body as a prison for the soul, sexuality as a distraction from spiritual pursuits, and physical pleasure as inherently suspect. This wasn't biblical thinking. Hebrew thought celebrated the body as God's good creation and sexuality as part of divine design. But Greek philosophy provided categories that seemed to make sense of Christian moral demands. Women's bodies were seen as both more tempting and more tempted. Church fathers developed elaborate theories about why women's bodies were more prone to sin. They were supposedly more emotional, more driven by physical appetites, more susceptible to demonic influence. At the same time, women's bodies were viewed as primary sources of temptation for men, requiring careful regulation and control. Christian sexual ethics became increasingly focused on prohibition and control rather than flourishing and relationships. The early church developed detailed regulations about sexual positions, frequency, timing, all designed to minimize pleasure and maintain the reproductive purpose as the only legitimate reason for sexual activity. Sexuality within marriage became something to be endured for procreation rather than celebrated as part of God's design for human intimacy. In conclusion, the theological developments of the first through fifth centuries created systemic doctrines that elevated virginity above marriage, associated sexuality with spiritual contamination, and established Mary and Mary Magdalene as opposing archetypes that split the feminine soul between impossible purity and redeemed fallenness.
Mr. Mick, how did early Christian doctrine begin to systematize these ideas about women, sexuality, and spiritual purity?
Well, these developments theologically interact with the broader cultural currents of late antiquity. What was happening in society either supported or challenged emerging ideas about women. The transformation of Christianity from a persecuted minority to the dominant cultural force in the Roman Empire created unprecedented opportunities and challenges. When you're a small countercultural movement, you can afford to be radical about gender roles and sexuality. But when you become responsible for governing entire societies, practical concerns start influencing theological positions. One huge factor was the rise of monasticism. The desert fathers and mothers of the third and fourth centuries were creating new models of Christian living that emphasized radical separation from worldly concerns, including sexuality and family life. These monastic communities produced some of the most influential Christian thinkers and leaders, and their values increasingly became seen as the highest expression of Christian faith. Monastic literature from this period is full of stories about holy men and women who achieved spiritual greatness through sexual renunciation. These stories became the popular entertainment of their day. They were exciting, dramatic, and they reinforced the message that true spiritual achievement required transcending normal human relationships and sexuality. The philosophical schools of late antiquity, Neoplatonism, Stoicism, various forms of dualism, all shared a suspicion of physical pleasure and bodily existence. Educated converts to Christianity brought these assumptions with them. Additionally, the Roman Empire's sexual culture was simultaneously permissive and exploitive. It was easy for Christian leaders to see sexuality itself as corrupting rather than distinguishing between healthy and unhealthy expressions of sexuality. Women's economic dependence on men made the church's emphasis on sexual purity a form of social control, whether intentionally or not. A woman's economic security depended entirely on her sexual reputation. The church's teachings about virginity and marital fidelity weren't just spiritual advice, they were survival strategies in a world where women had no independent economic options. There was often a significant gap between elite theological discourse and popular Christian practice. Archaeological evidence suggests that many Christian families continued to practice forms of sexuality and marriage that were more flexible than official church teaching. But the psychological impact of having your lived experience constantly measured against impossible theological ideals was profound. Some of the early Christian heresies, particularly various forms of Gnosticism, actually went further in rejecting sexuality and the body. Others, like Montanist groups, included prominent female leaders and prophets. But by the fourth century, the institutional church was consolidating around orthodox positions that excluded these alternatives. When Christianity became the official religion of the empire under Theodosius in 380, Christian sexual ethics became civil law. What had been internal spiritual discipline became external social regulation. This meant that theological positions about sexuality and women now had the force of imperial authority behind them. Christian missionaries carried these theological and cultural assumptions throughout Europe, Africa, and Asia. Indigenous cultures with different understandings of gender, sexuality, and spirituality were often required to conform to Christian norms that reflected 4th century Roman cultural assumptions as much as biblical teaching. The iconographic traditions that emerged during this period were incredibly powerful in shaping popular imagination. Mary is always portrayed as young, beautiful, and serene, the perfect Virgin Mother. Mary Magdalene, when she appears in art, is often shown with flowing hair, emotional expression, and dramatic gestures. The penitent whore. These visual representations reinforce the theological categories in ways that reach illiterate populations. On the one hand, the rise of Christian monasticism created unprecedented opportunities for some women to pursue education, spiritual authority, and independence from male control. Abbesses of major monasteries wielded significant power and influence. On the other hand, the theological emphasis on sexual purity created new forms of surveillance and control over women's bodies and behaviors. Many historians argue that the church's emphasis on virginity actually created more space for women to avoid marriage and pursue intellectual or spiritual vocations. But it also reinforced the idea that women's value was fundamentally tied to their sexual status. The virgin whore dichotomy became a cultural lens through which all women were viewed and judged. In conclusion, these cultural influences of late antiquity, from monastic ideals to imperial politics to artistic representations, combined with theological developments to create a comprehensive cultural framework that split feminine identity between the extremes of impossible purity and redeemed fallenness.
How did these theological developments interact with the broader cultural currents of late antiquity? What was happening in society that either supported or challenged these emerging ideas about women, Mr. Mag?
These ancient theological and cultural developments continue to shape contemporary attitudes toward women's sexuality and spirituality, and you can find a line through the 4th century to today. This is where the story becomes both deeply personal and profoundly hopeful. These ancient archetypes didn't just disappear when the Reformation happened or when secular feminism emerged. They've continued to operate in the psychological and cultural background of Western civilization, shaping how we think about sexuality, gender, and human worth in ways we often don't even recognize. Look at how we still categorize women in popular culture. You have the good girl and the bad girl, the wife material versus the fun but not serious woman. Dating apps and hookup culture have created new versions of the virgin whore split. Women are either pure, relationship focused, and deserving of commitment, or they're sexually available, fun, but not marriage material. It's the same psychological framework, just with different vocabulary. Purity culture and evangelical Christianity has created elaborate systems around protecting female virginity that often leave women feeling that their primary value is their sexual purity. Youth group lessons about being chewed gum or used tape if they become sexually active. These are direct descendants of the theological developments we've been discussing. When you go back to the actual teachings of Jesus and the earliest Christian communities, you discover a vision of human sexuality and gender relationships that's far more liberating and holistic than what developed in the 4th and 5th centuries. Early Christianity was incredibly countercultural in how it honored women, celebrated marriage, and understood the body as part of God's good creation. Jesus' interactions with women consistently broke down categories: the women at the well, Mary and Martha, the adulterous woman. Jesus related to each of them as a complete person, not as a representative of some category of female sexuality. He neither put them on pedestals nor reduced them to their sexual histories. Think about how different our culture might be if we operated from an understanding that every person, regardless of gender, is created for both spiritual and physical intimacy, that sexuality within committed relationships is part of the divine design, that our worth isn't determined by our sexual histories or choices. This isn't permissiveness, it's more a sophisticated understanding of human flourishing. The research on this is fascinating and heartbreaking. Women who grow up in religious environments often struggle with psychologists call the Madonna whore complex in reverse. They can't integrate their spiritual and sexual selves. Some forms of secular feminism have tried to solve the virgin whore problem by rejecting the virgin side entirely, celebrating sexual liberation as inherently empowering. But a Christian integrated anthropology would recognize that humans are created as embodied souls. We're not souls trapped in bodies, but whole persons designed for relationships that include both spiritual and physical intimacy. Imagine churches that taught comprehensive sexual ethics instead of just sexual prohibitions. And this requires both individual healing and community transformation. The virgin whore dichotomy has contributed to cultures that either overprotect innocent women or underprotect promiscuous women. I think we're living through a moment when both secular culture and religious communities are recognizing that the old frameworks around sexuality and gender aren't working. In conclusion, there's an opportunity for authentic Christian thought to offer something genuinely countercultural, not by returning to 4th century theological categories, but by recovering the liberating vision of human relationships that you see in Jesus' ministry.
Mr. Mick, how do these ancient theological and cultural developments continue to shape contemporary attitude toward women, sexuality, and spirituality? What's the through line from the 4th century to today?
And this really begins to our final thoughts on how individuals can begin to heal from ancient splits, bringing us up to the present day. We can start by recognizing that the either or categories are false. You don't have to choose between being spiritual or being sexual, between being pure and being passionate, between being good and being real. The God revealed in Jesus loves the whole person, body and soul, sexuality and spirituality, passion and purity. That integration is what we were created for, and it's what authentic Christian community should support and celebrate. While the theological developments of the early centuries created lasting damage to the virgin whore dichotomy, contemporary culture offers unprecedented opportunities to recover more integrated understandings of sexuality, spirituality, and the human flourishing that reflect the liberating vision of early Christianity. This has been an incredible journey through nearly 2 millennia of ideas that continue to shape our world. We thank everyone who listened and joined us for this deep dive. As we wrap up, remember, understanding history isn't about blame or shame. It's about freedom. When we understand how these ideas develop, we can make more conscious choices about which ones serve human flourishing and which ones need to be left behind. In conclusion, until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep growing.
Keep growing indeed, and very well said, Mr. Max. Very well said. For centuries, the Church's paradoxical veneration of the Virgin Mary and historical condemnation of sexual women created a devastating schism with the feminine soul, fracturing female identity into impossible, mutually exclusive archetype, the pure, eternal saint, and the sinful and the carnal temptress. Mr. Mink, would you like to plug in something?
I appreciate the opportunity. Write the book, grow the business. Connect with me on LinkedIn, GMIC, the Dr. Digital Smith, PhD. Listen to the Dr. Digital podcast. Pick up a couple volumes on Amazon, Burning America, and On Track Be an Author.
Yes, people, let's support Mr. Mink, the Dr. Digital, and the book itself because more and empowering skills actually become. And Mr. Mink, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, my friend. Till next time, stay as full.
Party con people.